Okay, I think we're live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this absolute internet bloodbath that we are about to have between my opponent, King Crocoduck, and yours truly, the ever amazing Justin, aka a thousand different other names. Uh, wow, that was a very a cringy opening, and I apologize for that. Without further ado, I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of. Well, first, actually, just say hi, Casey. Make sure everyone can hear you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
I sure hope so. It looks, yeah, there we go. Just waiting for confirmation that we can actually hear him.
The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog.
Every single letter.
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna just go ahead and assume unless someone says otherwise, they can hear you. All right, so this conversation that we're about to have has been a long time in the making. Casey put out on Twitter months ago, was it? Like end of October, early November? Am I getting that right?
If I still had Twitter at the time, then it was a very long time ago.
Okay. So a very long time ago, he put out a challenge to Natalie Wynn of ContraPoints to debate her on the merits of social justice in academia. And in lieu of her coming on, I decided I was going to reach out because this is a topic that I'm very interested in discussing with somebody. And then about a thousand different things happened in our personal lives that kept putting it off and off. And now here we are, several months later. Several feed pics were exchanged, several emails were exchanged, and now we're here. Finally, it's finally happening. I think I have stalled enough because I'm absolutely terrible at beginning streams on my own. So, Casey, please save me from having to talk on my own.
Sure, sure. To anyone who's in doubt, the foot part is absolutely true. Foot pics were exchanged. um, so, yeah, we're going to be talking about social justice in the academy, and even though we're having a kind of an adversarial position on this, as I was telling Jangles before the stream, I don't expect really much of a bloodbath here. My expectations for this discussion is I'm going to be presenting what I think are some of the problems with social justice scholarship in the academy. Jingles will probably present some of the things he thinks are awesome about social justice scholarship in the academy. And maybe we can arrive at some kind of middle ground where we can delineate between the circumstances in which social justice and the academy or good academic scholarship are able to coexist. Um, Barring that, if that doesn't work out, then I guess we'll just have to slit each other's throats or something.
Yeah, metaphorically in Minecraft, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So I actually think that in our initial email, you put out a very cogent case explaining your point. You put it much more eloquently than I could probably put it for you. So go ahead and, if you don't care, lay out your case about why there are problems with social justice infiltrating academia and knowledge production within it.
Sure. Um, well, broadly, I see three areas where there are problems that I would like to address. And these three areas broadly overlap with different areas in the social sciences and in the humanities. Um, so you can think of quote unquote quantitative social sciences, quote unquote qualitative social sciences, and quote unquote whatever it is those pesky humanists do. Um, and the way I'm going to be thinking about it is in terms of the quantitative costs that social justice scholarship may be imposing, the qualitative costs and the philosophical costs. So on the quantitative end, it's no secret now that social psychology and probably the other social sciences as well are experiencing a replication crisis. It's been generating a lot of buzz, a lot of heat, and I don't want to be excessively reductionist and say that it's because social justice warriors are infesting these disciplines and throwing their bison. Um, there are other things at play here. There's a generalizability crisis that's a lot less talked about, and we can talk about that further. There are issues with publication bias. Of course, there are issues with data dredging. Everybody knows so much ink has already been spilled on the topic of publish or perish and the effect that this has possibly had on p-hacking. My case, when it comes to the quantitative part of this discussion, is that social justice bias and political bias more generally can potentially exacerbate some of these maladies of the academy. So that's on the quantitative end. On the qualitative end, I have critiques of the interpretive frameworks that are being made use of by virtue of the fact that they seem empirically unaccountable. It seems that no matter what the data is, no matter what evidence is provided, there is a way of interpreting that evidence in such a manner that a preferred conclusion is going to come about. What in gender studies might be called a critical gender lens seems to me methodologically indistinguishable from Ken Ham's biblical glasses. So that's on the qualitative end. And then on the philosophical end, this is what I talk about the most on my YouTube channel these past few years. And that's the development of epistemologies, theories of knowledge, intended to accommodate overt bias of the sort that is amenable to the theorists coming out with these theories. And I have expressed my doubts about these theories of knowledge. And yeah, those are kind of the three horns of my disputes with social justice bias in the academy.
Okay, I think I broadly agree with, well, some of them, of course. So the replication crisis, absolutely. I think that it is a huge thorn in academia at the current moment that studies aren't funded that are just replicating other studies that have already been done, or at least that's not the case that I have seen at my university. It is really hard to convince any sort of funding agency to say, hey, I'm going to do this exact same study to see if I get the same results. So I would absolutely agree with that. There are a lot of things in academia that I think are that have a ton of problems with them, not the least of which being the rise of academic capitalism and the influx of private money for corporate interest in order to do studies that necessarily kind of have the same problems that you just described. Like, of course, you want a specific result if someone who has paid a lot of money is seeking a certain result. That's
I
coming at it.
agree. Yeah, the corporatization of the academy is a huge problem that I hope to touch upon in future videos. But please continue. Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's fine. Absolutely. The amount of research that I would need to do to understand that better is daunting and terrifying. So I'm just going to pretend that I know more than I'm letting on and move on. In terms of the qualitative aspect, so empirically unaccountable, I think I see broadly what you're trying to say there. So when you say something is empirically unaccountable in terms of qualitative studies, can you elaborate just a little bit more on that for me, please?
Sure, and it might be instructive to bring out an example. It's actually the example I'm going to be using for my next video. It's about
spoilers.
macho sperm. Yeah, it's literally about macho sperm.
Wait, what kind of sperm? I have to know.
Macho.
Macho sperm.
Yes.
I'm writing that in all capital letters, okay?
That should be my username for another YouTube channel.
There you go.
Anyway, the basic idea is in 1991, an anthropologist named Emily Martin published a paper in which she evaluated the metaphors being used by scientists in textbooks and in peer-reviewed papers when they were describing the characteristics of fertilization, how sperm fertilize egg. And by her reckoning, the language being used betrayed an androcentric bias, a masculine bias that was shaping scientists' understanding of how fertilization takes place. And by her account, there was evidence emerging in the 1960s that scientists were ignoring up until the 1980s, or at least that they didn't know what to do with up until the 1980s, when these social critiques started coming around and when gender roles started changing. And only now did scientists begin to see, oh, wait a minute, the egg is not as passive and feminine as we used to think, traditionally feminine. It actually plays a proactive role during fertilization. And the sperm, they're not like these brave warriors who are rushing up this hostile vaginal territory to save their damsel in distress egg. The egg is this, the sperm are incompetent swimmers, your incompetent kind of weak men who now the strong woman has to send out her microovuli, I believe. I'll have to reread the study in order to pull the sperm in and initiate this process of fertilization. And I have critiques of the history that I won't get into because I don't think the history she's describing is correct. But when you look at her analysis of the language, you can see that you can argue it either way, honestly. So I'll quote one passage in particular just to illustrate the sort of thing I'm talking about. Okay. She says, the egg coat, its protective barrier, is sometimes called its vestments, a term usually reserved for sacred religious dress. The egg is said to have a corona, a crown, and to be accompanied by attendant cells. It is wholly set apart and above, the queen to the sperm's king. So she's quoting things like attendant cells, like attendants' vestments, the things that are worn by royalty. It has a corona, so a crown. So the egg is basically a queen. But she doesn't quote anything about the sperm that could really be interpreted as king. What she goes on to say is she characterizes the sperm, or the text characterized the sperm as being on a mission, which is to move through the female genital tract in quest of the ovum. So she's interpreting this as a kind of traditional patriarchal relationship of king and queen. But I'm thinking you could just as easily interpret this as the queen sending her foot soldier on a mission to do something, or one of these attendant sperm there to do as the queen wants. It doesn't seem that either interpretation really has any advantage over the other. I think when a person engages in this kind of deciphering of the text, we learn more about that person than we do about the actual text.
There is an interesting conversation to be had about interpretation of texts. I have 2 points to bring up on that. One is that it is arguably, since most, when science is recorded, it is for the most part recorded in a written format. So most information is written down, published, and distributed that way. And so the text is a form, like, you could argue it is the whole of science, like writing it. What is that quote from the Mythbusters, like the difference between screwing around and science is writing it down? So you could be argued like the text is the whole of science, and therefore it is subject to a form of literary criticism. Like the way a scientist decides to put their findings into words is a really interesting topic to discuss. And since now we're talking about language, your language is contextual and based on the culture that you're in. So I have a quote here: "The all acts of naming happen against a backdrop of what is socially accepted as real." So that there is an interesting point to be had about, yeah, it is, when scientists use language to describe their findings, they are using metaphors and naming conventions that are, situated socially, and that could, if in interpretations of their work, that could flavor the kind of feel of it, if not necessarily, like, I'm not saying it will ruin the findings, and now that everybody who reads any paper written by a man is now going to be sexist, going to be thinking about, protecting the eggs, Stefan Molyneux style, but I think it is interesting that the way we write our findings is going to impact and influence how we read them.
Well, I'll have more to say on the topic of science as language momentarily if we get to the philosophical part. But I think that my principal objection to methods that purport to reveal the truth about what it is people are thinking when you interpret their texts is I'm not really sure how it is that they know that their interpretation is the correct one. And as a thought experiment, she admits later in her paper, and I'm quoting, "Far less is known about the physiology of sperm than comparable female substances." And she goes on to say that this is because one second here. Greater scientific scrutiny of female reproduction has long enabled the burden of birth control to be placed on women. So the reason why we have a greater understanding of, a weaker understanding of sperm than of the female substances she's alluding to is because society wants to control female reproduction. But, as I read this, just as a thought experiment, what if it were the other way around? What if we had a much better understanding of the structure of sperm than we did of these uh, female substances that she's alluding to? Uh, what would she be saying then? Would she say that this is because society, would she say the contrapositive, that this is because society is matriarchal and wants to control men's reproductive capacities? Or is she going to say what her contemporaries say when this kind of thing comes up? And that's that science is dominated by men and men are only interested in men's issues. Um,
I think there are cases to be made in both, but I kind of agree with the notion that what we study the most is what society has deemed important. So if I think there is a point to be made that if we are studying the reproductive anatomy of women far more than we study the reproductive anatomy of men, there has to be a reason for that, right? And that reason is arguable, but there has to be a reason.
I agree that there is a reason, but I don't think that that reason is necessarily social. I will agree that social influences do play a role in things like the distribution of funding and what should we call it? The intensity with which some subjects are pursued in relation to others. That's trivially true. But I think fundamentally the reason why we have a better understanding of the female reproductive system isn't because of some. It's not a result as a result of the demographics involved, but rather because the female reproductive system is much more important to fertilization. Nobody is trying to uh, clone animals out of sperm. They're only using eggs to do this. Um, I think that fundamentally it comes down to epistemic values that are independent of social values, values like predictive accuracy and explanatory efficiency.
I obviously agree that those things are very important, accuracy and predictive value. But I mean, the history of science is one of, social influence dictating like how we interpret results, correct?
Well, I think it's useful to delineate between three different aspects of the scientific enterprise. And um, when I'm talking about the science, I'm talking about specifically um, the cognitive content of science, the content of our best empirical theories. And I think this is distinct from these other two categories I'm about to lay out, which are the extent to which we pursue one science in relation to another, the types of resources available to us in order to be able to pursue said sciences. That's one that's related to what ultimately comes out in the cognitive content of our best empirical theories, but it's conceptually distinct. And the other is the rate at which scientific knowledge advances. So whether we acquire a particular aspect of scientific knowledge today or 2 years from now as a consequence of social relations, it's also related to the cognitive content, but it's still conceptually distinct. So these first two categories, the extent and urgency in which we're going to pursue some question in relation to another, how much we're funding them, what resources are available and that we're willing to dispense, that's socially influenced. The aspect that involves the speed with which scientific research it can accrue, that can also be socially influenced. But when it comes to the actual cognitive content, what is contained within our empirical theories, I think that historically, looking into natural history, this precedes even the existence of societies, even the existence of human beings.
I'm sorry, can you explain that last one more time for me?
Sure. So when we are developing our models of the world, we're engaging in a process that I think is continuous with our natural history. We're always engaging in the development of models, regardless of whether or not occupationally we're scientists. I'm receiving information. I'm receiving sensory inputs, with my five senses. But that's being organized in a manner. My mind is organizing this information and sorting it in order to produce a model of the world. When I walk through a forest, I don't see browns and greens and grays, right? I see squirrels, I see rocks, I see trees. And I think that if you look back into our evolutionary history, and look at the role that's being played by the capacity to develop increasingly accurate and efficient models of the world, I think a picture begins to emerge of the scientific activity as having primordial roots, as being fundamentally a natural activity, even if later on social species come along and they, uh, humans in particular, having language, are able to communicate the models and talk to each other about it and improve the models. At its core, the development of models, I think, is a natural process, and it's a process whose cognitive contents are unpolluted uh, by society, at least when it's done well. What do you think of all that?
I'm sorry, I'm writing that down. I'm a slow writer and I like to take notes. Sorry.
You're good.
Development of models is a natural process. I think I agree with the spirit of what you're saying, but where I disagree is that I think beyond instincts, that all of the knowledge that builds upon itself and that is passed from generation to generation is necessarily social. The information that we gain from our ancestors and that survive and to be taught to us isn't necessarily dictated by what is, sometimes it's dictated by what's most explanatory and what's most helpful for us to survive, but it's also socially situated. Like, for example, sometimes, for the longest time, man, uh, uh, racism in science was a real thing. Racialism was a generally accepted scientific, you know, scientific pursuit. It was generally accepted as true that human beings had evolved into different races, and evolution was an explanatory, model of as a reason for that. And a lot of the reasons that happened, for example, the reason that okay, we have five different distinct races and evolution helps explain it, wasn't because science told us that. It was because the social situation that naturally saw a hierarchy of human beings, or even human beings and then subhuman beings, that came first, and then science came along to explain the social aspect of it. So in that case, in this instance, for example, uh, society absolutely dictated what science said.
Well, I think there's an argument to be made that what they're engaging in is not actually properly science. If you take, for example, phrenology, um, initially, as far as I'm aware, it wasn't motivated by racism. I might be wrong on this point, but I believe they were just trying to explain the contents uh, of human cognition in terms of what they could see physiologically in the shape of the head. And I think as science matured and as the evidence started coming in, it became clear that this was not correct, and there's nothing to be gained from this model. I mean, we have to, I think, understand science as having a function, and that function relies upon epistemic values rather than social ones. And those epistemic values I characterize in terms of what I call the big four. These are the big four operational criteria that I think are common to good scientific theories, that all scientific theories fundamentally aspire to. And these are predictive accuracy, explanatory efficiency, optimal flexibility, and rational coherence. And I think that if you're engaged in the business of developing a model that is in contravention of the big four, um, I don't think that what you're engaging in is properly science. If you and I are playing a game of chess and our rooks are moving diagonally and our pawns are moving backwards, it doesn't really matter that we've adopted the paraphernalia of chess. We're not actually playing chess. And in the same way, you can see where I'm going.
Yeah, of course. Where I object to that is that the racialism that we were talking about, just as an example, because I'm debating a neo-Nazi in a week, and I've done a lot of research on racialism.
Sure.
That was good science for the time. I mean, it followed all the models. It wasn't thought of as being, it was just accepted as kind of like an a priori truth that, of course, there are different races of humanity. We've always thought that. It's kind of accepted as truth in society. And so that's going to guide our science going into it. And of course, when you do that, you will find average differences between populations. But the concept of the race came before that, and that came socially situated. And I'm sure that scientists at the time still tried to do the best they could to remain objective, to take their own thoughts and feelings out of this situation, but they were nonetheless influenced by their culture, and since they came to a wrong conclusion. So I want to ask you well, if you can respond to that really quick if you'd like.
Sure. Well, I agree that social influence has played a role in the types of hypotheses that were being developed. Um, of course, a social influence you can have a dream. Uh, you can have completely arbitrary reasons for pursuing a hypothesis, but um, if it doesn't work, then there's no good reason to hold on to it, and you kind of have to accept that. When you don't do that, I think you're doing science badly. With respect to phrenology specifically, as far as I'm aware, the broader scientific community by the 1880s, 1890s even, um, had already dismissed it as junk because it wasn't giving them any good results. You know, you can argue this or that ideology, but fundamentally, if the results aren't coming in, if the predictions aren't succeeding, there's a problem. There's a reason why paradigm shift, and that reason is the crisis. If yeah, yeah, eventually theory makes contact with reality. So even if the theory, the initial hypothesis is motivated by social relations, what actually comes out of that that's genuinely scientific, uh, I think obeys only epistemic values rather than social ones.
I think my biggest objection to that is that until another paradigm comes along with which to shift, with which to cause a scientific revolution, or whatever you would prefer to call it, that kind of is the good science for the time. I mean, until something else comes along, you don't know that what you have isn't the best thing that isn't the best thing that you have. Functionally, we have to act as if the best information we have available right now is the truth. We can accept that conceptually this isn't the whole truth, but if we're ever going to move forward, we have to accept that the best knowledge that we have right now is as true as we have it right now, and we have to use that going forward. So, all the quote unquote bad science that was done at the time was good science at the time. It wasn't the process of collecting that data that made it bad. It was that the furtherment of scientific research revealed it to be untrue. So he still followed the scientific method to achieve conclusions that were erroneous, but that doesn't make it bad science. That just makes it incomplete science, and that incomplete science could have social factors that led to false assumptions that guided the research. By the way, if I'm
But
ever talking for too long, shut me up.
sure, but are those social factors to be found within the cognitive content of the theory itself, or do they issue from that first category, the types of hypotheses that are pursued in relation to social questions?
I'm terribly sorry. I was looking at chat for 2 seconds, and then your big brain takes are, and that was a compliment, by the way. I missed two words, and I couldn't understand it. Can you repeat that again?
Okay, so um, you have a social influence in the selection of which hypothesis and which research program to pursue, right?
Right.
And then the cognitive content that comes out of that, um, is that content genuinely scientific? When we're talking about the social influence seems to come in at this first stage, the stage of hypothesis selection, rather than at this latter stage of the actual cognitive content of the theory.
Oh, okay. Okay, I got you now. I would actually argue that both are social. And the reason I say that is because, who decides whether or not a scientific theory or model is accurate? Who decides whether or not it's explanatory? Other
Well,
scientists.
I think that question it reminds me of when I'm being asked who created the universe. It assumes something about the properties of scientific theories and of models more generally that I don't think is necessarily true. I think that when we're looking at models of the world, we're looking uh, at a means of explaining and predicting phenomena, and if it fails to do that, I don't understand in what sense it could be called scientific.
Yeah, but again, who decides whether or not it's explanatory? Now, when I say it's socially situated, that I don't put any sort of negative connotations to something being socially situated. I am a big old humanist. I think we're fucking awesome. We could have gone this entire time without cursing. Now, demonetized right there. Uh, I think we're awesome, and that's, in my opinion, and this would be something that you can expand on and disagree with, that the highest form of scientific objectivity that we can aspire to is consensus, and that there's really nothing above that gives a scientific theory any more credence other than a scientific consensus of people in the field who agree that this is generally the best explanatory theory or model. Would you disagree with that or agree with that?
I think I would disagree with that.
Okay.
I'm reminded of Richard Rorty's famous quote that truth is whatever your contemporaries allow you to get away with saying. And I think that what this kind of view neglects to consider is that there are operational criteria that come prior to any social influence. We wouldn't have been able to survive for this long if it were strictly a matter of consensus. It's not exhausted by ideology. There's something more fundamental to it. If the model doesn't work, it's going to be abandoned. Yes, there's a community of scientists involved, and they can adjust the standards for what constitutes good prediction, good explanation. But the impetus for that fundamentally isn't social but epistemic.
Do you think that there? I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this. Do you think there is something outside of humanity, outside of the shared human experience, or for whatever meaningless statement that is an objective truth?
I'm agnostic on that. I don't think that it makes any sense to talk about an abstract metaphysical entity that exists just beyond the veil of our experience. I think that all things that exist within the totality of our best empirical theories.
I would actually agree with that. But
And before you respond to that, I think that the contents of our best empirical theories, when those theories are done well, are influenced by epistemic values rather than social ones.
I guess I'm having trouble distinguishing between epistemic values and social values because just the word value there is throwing me off.
Sure. So when I'm thinking of epistemic values, I'm thinking of the things pertaining to our understanding, things pertaining to our knowledge of the world. What we're talking about epistemology, but there's something more fundamental to that I've been leaning toward, and that's axiology. We're talking axiologically when we're talking about values, and values can come in different forms. They can come in an epistemic form, but they can also come in a moral form, with with a discipline like ethics. And I think there's a case to be made that axiology is prior to both. So when we're talking about values, we're not talking about something that exists exclusively within the domain of moral philosophy. We're also talking about something that exists within the domain of epistemology. So think of a Venn diagram. The big one, the biggest circle is axiology, and then it has two smaller circles inside of it, and that's epistemology and ethics.
I actually drew the Venn diagram.
Cool.
Ethics. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to respond to that. Probably because I only understood the Venn diagram part when I got to draw the pretty picture.
Okay, let me try to put it another way. Maybe this will be helpful with the Venn diagram facilitating. When we're talking about values, we're talking about something that's more fundamental than either ethics or epistemology. Both ethics and epistemology issue, at least in part, from this more fundamental thing. But this more fundamental thing is conceptually independent of these other two features. So when we're talking about certain values that are influencing the cognitive content of our scientific theories, it's possible to say that there do exist values, but that those values are excuse me, not of a moral or of a political variety, but of a variety that pertains to our knowledge of the world, to our theories of truth.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That makes a little bit more sense, yeah. Do you believe in the alternative ways of knowing things other than the scientific method?
This is something that I struggle with a lot. If somebody tells me, they read a poem and they tell me that they know what's inside of the poet's heart based on what they've read, I'm struggling to understand what exactly it means they know what's in the poet's heart. as far as I'm concerned, the only way to know what's inside of the poet's heart is to cut it out and look at it. Um, so I think I'm undecided on. I don't want to be totalitarian in the sense that all knowledge must be scientific. I do think there is a continuity between scientific knowledge and social science knowledge and humanistic knowledge. I don't view philosophy and science as being conceptually distinct or one being prior to the other. I do think there's continuity there. So,
I always
um,
understood that philosophy preceded science. That was my
sorry.
understanding. It was my understanding that philosophy preceded science.
Yeah, that's what philosophers tell themselves.
That's what philosophy.
No. Well, if we think back to what I was saying earlier about this, the science being something primordial, the project of developing accurate models of the world preceding the existence of humans and of society, I do think there's a case to be made that what we might call proto-science came before what might be called proto-philosophy, and then from there you have your official classical philosophy, and then your official modern science, and the things of that nature.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to situate all of this within a kind of within a natural history, acknowledging that our natural history is continuous with our social history.
Yeah, I think I have 2 points to respond to that. One, and it goes a little bit further back. I know you're not a big fan of Derrida. I tried to read him, and about 2 bottles of bourbon later, I realized that I was not going to get through it. So uh, I read a bunch of compendiums of people who tried to understand him, and I actually think there's some validity to his idea that there's nothing outside the text. That's something that I genuinely think is interesting and a good way to look at a good way to look at text because of course there's no way to genuinely connect to another person's what they're thinking. There's no direct connection between my brain and yours. All we have are signs. We have language in one form or another, and I'm trying to put my thoughts very feebly into words in order to communicate a version of what I'm thinking to you, and then you're going to take that language and then interpret it via your own filter and try to get that concept. So we played telephone until my idea is necessarily warped by the time it gets to you. That's sort of, very loosely, what I think Derrida means when he says there's nothing outside of the text. Like, that
Yeah,
text is not, there
no,
is no truth in that text.
that's a good summary. And I don't hate Derrida or anything. I just disagree with the guy. But you may have noticed a parallel between what he said about there's nothing outside of the text and what I said about everything that exists does so within our best empirical theories. Um, So where Derrida's response to that would be, yes, Casey, you're absolutely correct. Everything that exists does so within the context of your best empirical theories, and your best empirical theories exist as a consequence of signs within a discourse. And to him, I would retort, but wait a minute, our best empirical theories existed prior to the invention of any signs, prior to the invention of any language, by virtue of the natural history that I'm alluding to.
Okay. Your impression of Derrida wasn't very good. You didn't have a sentence that lasted 9 paragraphs with 45 semicolons. I hate to tell you.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to offer you my condolences for having to read. Was it a grammatology that you read?
It was of grammatology that I looked at.
Yeah, that's about. I too, quote unquote, looked at of grammatology and acquired very little from it. So I can only imagine having to get through all 350 or whatever, however many pages for well, I guess ultimately for your own your own learning.
Yeah, it ended up being fun, and I completely forgot the second thing I was about to say. Can you get
Shoot,
my wheels turning a little bit more? What were we talking about?
we were talking about science, whether the structure of science is fundamentally
Oh, okay,
linguistic
okay, okay,
or whether
okay.
it's fundamentally natural.
There was a definition of science that I actually really, really liked in it for its simplicity. That science is disciplined inquiry. I like it. I like simple things. I like short sentences. But I really like that definition of science, disciplined inquiry, because it does kind of predate the scientific method. So, how can we know things? Well, we ask things in a way that is intentional and disciplined. So, I think that's a really good way of taking our the totality of human knowledge that predates the scientific method and all the wonderful things that's brought us, and still tells us, well, actually, yeah, we still were able to know things. We were able to pass on that knowledge into a future generation so that they could start have a head start in the next generation and things like that. But to me that makes science. I know you don't like this, and I've been advised not to say this, but uh, science is a social construct, and you kind of said one of your videos that that's a truism. Like, of course it is. It wouldn't exist without humans. Uh,
Right, right. Yeah, there's a trivial sense in which one can say that science is a social construct, and then there's the more controversial sense that I go over in my Science Wars series. But I want to get to something you keep bringing up, and that's the scientific method.
mhm.
What exactly do you think that is?
The scientific method, as explained to me in my research methods. Oh, I actually have the book here. Is light gonna wash it out? Research methods and physical activity. Oh, you can't see it, but they can. So basically, the scientific method of problem solving is one, develop, define, and delimit the problem. Two, formulate the hypothesis. Three, gather data, and four, analyze and interpret the results. So a really simple version of it, but that's what was told to me in my textbook.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to differ from the textbook and say something radical and crazy. So brace yourself. I
Oh
don't think
no.
there actually is a scientific method.
Okay. Actually, the textbook kind of said that too.
Oh,
Where is it? It was. I liked it. It was a really good quote. Up, up, up. Oh, come on. It's a really good quote. Tell me I wrote it down. No. Oh, that's actually
well,
that sucks.
while you're searching, I'll just elaborate on what exactly I think. I mean, I don't think that there's a particular method. You know, I used to think that it was falsifiability. I thought that criterion alone could distinguish a science from not a science. Um, but I've shifted my thinking since then to the operational criteria, to the big four. And what's really attractive to me about these big four is that the impetus for them isn't social, even though they can have social effects, and of course they do have social effects. Fundamentally, they issue from natural impulses, the will to live, as Schopenhauer might have called it. Um, Not that I'm an existentialist,
I
but
gotcha.
yeah, I think when we're talking about quote unquote scientific method, more generally the scientific activity, I think we're talking about an activity um, that predates the social.
I like that definition of that it kind of stems from the will to live. It's a really basic, really primordial driving force behind the desire to acquire knowledge. So I think I definitely agree with that. Did I interpret what you said correctly?
Hmm.
Okay, good, awesome. Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that.
And I just
Uh,
want to pause and say I'm really liking our conversation. I think it's very productive, and yeah,
yeah.
you're a good host.
Oh, no, I'm very, very awkward as a host. So, but thank you for that anyway. So let's. Where should we take it from here? Let's see if we can disagree on something a little bit more fundamentally.
Sure.
Because that's. I did read as much as I could of Thomas Kuhn's book. Uh, what was it? Scientific. I forgot the name of it.
Yeah, structure of scientific
There we go.
revolutions.
There
That's
we go. I
a
read as
very
much.
important one.
Yeah, very, very important. I got it at a used bookstore, which was very, very nice. Uh, um, and I
Oh, you should
like
have hit me up. I would have given you a free PDF.
I should have. I like physical books. They're fun. I get a draw on them. And he's kind of the one, and I know that he gets abused quite a bit. Like I know he really disagrees with like the claims of relativism that a lot of people misinterpret his work for. But it's something that I really agreed with, like that nature of a paradigm shift. Like for example, in biomechanics, or I guess exercise physiology, there's a lot of overlap between the two. There's this theory called the popping sarcomere theory. It's a garbage theory, makes no sense. It's been outdated forever, but there's still people who cling on to it, like because it's what they know. They did it for 30 years and they refuse to let go of it, no matter how much research comes along to prove it wrong. So that I thought that was fun to hear. There's another researcher that I thought was interesting, and I guarantee that if you haven't heard of him, you probably have, that you'll disagree with what his take is. So Michael Polanyi, does that name ring a bell?
The name does ring a bell, and I do think I read something of his, but I don't recall what it was. But I do think I didn't like it, so that must be why I didn't remember it.
Okay. If I can completely butcher his interpretation or his argument, he says that since at every point during the scientific process, we are making decisions based on what we think is best. We are imparting our own values into what we think is best at every step of the scientific process, from the instruments we choose to the measurements that we decide to take to the selection of variables to our analysis and interpretation of the results. That scientific objectivity is something that is forever outside of our reach.
Okay, so I agree with the part that he said that we make use of values when making these selections. But you can probably guess what I'm going to say, and that's that I think these values are of an epistemic rather than social nature. When it comes to objectivity, so there's a little bit of fuzziness as to what exactly that word means. Some people will think objectivity is the capacity to look at the world, have a view of everywhere from nowhere.
Yeah, I read that one.
Yeah. And I don't agree with that view of objectivity. I think objectivity is the capacity to evaluate things um, independently of social values. You can make use of epistemic values and still be objective. But as long as you're putting social values off to the side, as long as they're not unduly influencing whatever it is you're looking at, you can still maintain objectivity. Even with your very limited and situated perspective, your position in the world.
Okay, this is where I think that we might have some productive disagreements. So you just said that well, I don't want to tell you what you said. Uh, do you think that it is good to put social values aside when performing science, broadly speaking?
Well, I don't want to be too broad, because clearly social values do influence those first two categories I was talking about.
Hmm.
But when it comes to social values influencing the cognitive content of the theory, I don't think that's good. I do agree with things like bioethical constraints upon the types of experiments we're allowed to perform. And this would fall under the category one aspect of the scientific enterprise. Um, but so long as we're clear about where social values are allowed to belong and where, by implication, social justice values are allowed to belong.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that's what we were supposed to be talking about.
but
But
it's
no,
important.
we got there. We got there.
Yeah.
We got there organically. That was nice.
Yeah,
Um,
but maybe you can see how there can be room for compromise then, if we delineate between the cognitive content of the scientific theory versus these other two categories where social justice influence may have some influence, subject to some negotiation, of course.
I think, and I don't think you'll disagree with this too much, that in things like physics, the really, really hard sciences, things like physics, and you get physics at the very, very top, the hardest of hard sciences, and then it gets softer and softer and softer from that. I think in the tip of the top of the hard sciences, I don't really see any like even in biomechanics for the most part, I don't think social justice can have an effect really either way. But as we get towards the quote unquote softer sciences, it's obviously going to have more and more of an impact because the values that we have going into scientific inquiry start to become more and more social. For example, in medical research, I think it's good and necessary to have social values guiding the research at all levels. The ultimate goal of medical research is to make people feel better and make them healthier, both of which are subjective qualities that can be socially and individually contextualized, correct?
Is health really fundamentally subjective and socially constructed? I mean,
I
I know
believe so,
people
yeah.
will bring up Foucault in support of the affirmative. Um, but I do think that fundamentally you can reduce something like health uh, in a broad and general manner to epistemic values. But putting that up to the side, just really
Well,
quickly,
put a pin in that.
I want to address what you said about hard and soft science. So I actually am not sure if there's a real distinction between the two. I don't call anything a hard science or a soft science. I think there's good science and there's bad science, and that what sorts one type of science into another is the capacity to which it adheres to the development of models that meet the big four, right? So when it comes to social values creeping I don't think it's so much a function of softness as it is a function of science just being done badly.
I think in terms of social sciences, that there are so many variables to consider that it is just an enormously complex beast, and it's still in its relative infancy, and that our explanatory models just aren't developed enough yet. Just because of the sheer enormous complexity there is between human interactions. Theoretically, under the paradigm of reductionism, we can take humans are made of parts that will, if you get it down to its most basic elements, cells interacting with cells, and parts of cells interacting with itself. We can predict things.
Yeah, yeah. I don't. But I know where you're going. I'm just going to say outright, I don't believe that there's such a thing as a societal wave function. I don't think we can reduce society in the manner that you're suggesting. Right? Is this where you're going?
It's what.
Those methods are just not available to us
Oh,
at
of
the social.
course. Oh, yeah. That I definitely agree with. It is just so far outside of the realm of current human capabilities that it might as well not exist. But that
Right.
doesn't mean we can't work towards better explanatory variables using what we have. Just like the earliest people figured out that rocks will fall when you let go of them. That was a step in the right direction. That it increased the amount of human knowledge. I think we can do the same thing in the. I'm just going to call them social sciences, if that's okay. We can start making efforts towards those explanatory models. They can help predict more human behavior to a greater extent. There's an interesting discussion on ethics of whether or not that's even a good thing to do to predict human behavior. I haven't seen the Minority Report, but that's something to consider. I think that kind of falls outside of the bounds of this discussion.
Yeah, but
If that's
you're
okay.
touching on something that's interesting and that I want to briefly explore,
Sure.
and that's the role of interpretation in the social sciences.
Hmm.
Um, since these hard quantitative methods of the physical sciences are only available to a limited extent. I mean, sure, social scientists can make use of linear and logistic regression functions, um, and we talked a little bit about replication crisis and how some of the possible reasons for that, but there also seems to be this push to have an interpretive element to it, something what the Germans I think used to call Wissenschaft. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but
You are, as far as I know.
what do you speak?
No,
You
no,
don't
no, no,
speak.
no, no, not even a little.
Uh, and that's evaluating society as a member of society.
Hmm.
Um, and this leads to the kinds of complaints I was talking about earlier with excessive flexibility of these models of being able to interpret things in any manner you like. And where the hell was I going with this? It was really important.
It's okay. I've been there.
Oh, this is frustrating. Right. So if I ask a hypothetical social scientist, why are you making use of these interpretive methods? They'll say, well, I don't have the physicist's toolkit available to me. This is the best I have. And I'm reminded of the story of the drunk man searching for his keys under the streetlight. Have you heard that one?
No, I have not.
So there's a police officer walking along in the middle of the night, and he sees a guy who's like rummaging on the sidewalk under the street. And he goes up to the guy. He's like, "What's going on?" And the guy, he's drunk. He says, "Oh, I lost my keys." And the officer said, "Well, okay, let me help you look for it." So he gets on the ground with him, and they start searching around under the street light for the key. And after about 10 minutes of this, the police officer is very frustrated. He's like, "Are you sure you lost your key here?" And the drunk man responds, "No, I lost it in that dark park over there." And the officer responds, "Well, why are you searching for it over here if it's in the park?" And the drunk man responds, "This is where the light is at."
I actually have another a fairly short joke to tell along those lines as well. So
Let's hear it.
two men are in a hot air balloon and the currents sweep them away and eventually they have no idea where they are. So they lower the hot air balloon to the first person they find, and they ask the person that they find, "Excuse me, sir, where are we?" And the man points out, "You're in a hot air balloon." And one of the men in the hot air balloon turns to the other and says, "I bet that man is a researcher." He goes, "Why do you think that?" Well, he told us something that was technically accurate, but completely useless.
That is
Uh,
pretty fun.
yeah, so we get a lot of that in the physical activities. So, for example, you can do all the laboratory tests you can in the world on muscle physiology, but the laboratory tests you do on muscle physiology and how muscles behave under extremely strict conditions are so far removed from how actual training works that you're almost better off trusting a coach's instinct or gut or any number of completely unscientific methods because oddly enough that coach's gut might have more explanatory value than the laboratory test would be. So,
But if it has more explanatory value, wouldn't that make it more scientific?
I guess it depends on the. Yeah, yeah. If we're using that definition of scientific, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking at it as operational criteria rather than the use of paraphernalia. To think back to our example with chess. Um,
Oh, I would. So, on my definition, sorry, let me try that again. In my definition of science, which is discipline inquiry, I don't count intuition and hunches as scientific discipline inquiry. But nonetheless, that unscientific method of problem solving could be more explanatory for an athlete than something like a laboratory test. So
is,
the
is there
example,
anything I can do to convince you to adopt my operational criteria uh, as your definition of science?
probably, yeah. One more time. Do you care? Just one more time, because I want to try to write it down.
Sure, I'll give you time to write down the big four. So the big four are predictive accuracy,
Predictive accuracy,
explanatory efficiency,
explanatory EFF,
mhm, optimal flexibility,
optimal flexibility,
and rational coherence.
rational coherence. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's perfectly fine.
And science is the set of activities, not any particular method, but any activity um, that allows us to develop models that increasingly meet these operational criteria. So the coach's hunch, um, even though you're not able to necessarily operationalize that within a scientific context in a manner that allows for better prediction and explanation than what you might call this folk theory. Um, you can work toward the development of that model, and eventually, when you do have that operationalized, uh, that operationalized model, then you do have your replacement of the old coach said so model, the old coach said so paradigm.
Okay. Um, yeah.
Just really quickly, just to show you the extent of my commitment to this view, if wiggling our ear and sticking out our tongue gave us a means of being able to predict and explain data, or better and explain things, I would consider wiggling your ear and sticking out your tongue as part of the catalog of science.
I've never tried it, so I can't say whether that would work or not.
Yes,
So
that must be why.
that must be
But
why.
do you see where I'm coming from, though?
No, yeah, actually, yeah. If I'm honest, I'm surprised. Yeah, I'm surprised you take that position, and yeah, I definitely agree with that. It is whatever has the most explanatory value. I thought we were gonna have a fight. So, from what it understands, you aren't opposed to things like qualitative research, right?
No, no, no. The qualitative and quantitative, these both have a place in the physical and the social sciences. Um, what matters is that we have to have we have to be careful that we're not giving too much license to the drunk man who's searching under the street lamp, because the keys are in the park. But that isn't a license to look under the street lamp. That means we have to engage in the development of methodologies that will allow us to search in the park, be those methodologies qualitative or quantitative. And my critique of the qualitative methodologies is that they involve uh, not all qualitative methodologies, but the bad ones. They involve rummaging on the sidewalk where we know the keys are not at. We know that literary criticism isn't a way of predicting and explaining phenomenon, but it nevertheless occupies a central position uh, among certain qualitative methods. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. So my research has been basically split between biomechanics and educational researchers. So I'm studying to be a teacher. So for the past 8 or so months, half of my research has been on studies into academia, the process of education, specifically adult education. And of course, we see a lot of qualitative analyses and theories there. So some, and as far as I know, the vast majority of research into pedagogy is qualitative and almost exactly feels over reals in the sense that they use a lot of emotionally loaded language. But I've always at first I was really averse to that because I'm a big science rational brain boy. But at the end of the day, it's emotion that actually matters more than the facts that you're teaching in terms of whether or not you're going to communicate that knowledge to your peers, or not your peers, but well, you might even think of your students as your peers if you're hippy dippy enough, and I can certainly see myself becoming that sort of hippie. Where was I going with this? Oh, but if we can find those explanatory frameworks, so I'm really familiar with cultural historical activity theory. It's something I use to explain why online teachers fucking hate their jobs. That's a very academic way of putting my research, by the way.
Okay.
And it made a lot of sense to me. Uh, that doesn't mean that of course doesn't mean that it's correct, but it seemed like a theory that could hold a lot of explanatory value in determining how certain activities occur, especially in respect to learning. Like, why are some teachers just awful, and why are some teachers good? There must be some sort of criterion that we could judge that on, at least loosely, despite the enormous amount of variables that go into a single classroom setting, let alone an entire academic career. So I'm actually really happy to hear that you're in favor of things like qualitative research as long as it adheres to those four principles that you laid out.
Yeah, yeah. The operational criteria. Yeah, and we're coming to the close now, but we should probably start wrapping up soon. But I just want to emphasize that these operational criteria, in my view, issue from epistemic concerns rather than social ones, even if social concerns are addressed incidentally by these criteria.
Okay. So I'm, I apologize for the audience that we didn't touch on social justice in academia all that much. We mostly talked about the philosophy of science. I hope that was still fun to watch. Uh, let's see if we can get one little point about social justice in academia. You've laid out some of the problems that you have in how they guide their research and how it affects specifically that last thing, the cognitive aspect of uh, interpretation. No, I butchered that. I'm sorry. Um,
Yeah, the cognitive content of the theory.
yeah. Uh, I think rather than try to tell you what you think back to you, I'm just going to say what I think. So for a lot of especially social sciences, the relatively new fields of studying human behavior and how we interact with each other, I think those are enormously important. Obviously, our human interactions are. I think it's a truism that they're important to most of us. That we would rather have good human interactions, favorable, mutually beneficial, cordial human interactions than not. And so it's worth studying those phenomena in order to facilitate better human interactions. But that is definitely putting values into that social science research because the goal is how can we make this better, and what you consider better could vary tremendously in
I
terms of what
agree.
you're yeah.
But the placement of the values are in that first category we were talking about earlier, which pertains to our decision of which research to pursue and to what extent. I
Right.
view this kind of thing as being in the same category as how do we, we want to allocate resources, more research, more, blah. We want to allocate more resource sources to cancer research than to high energy physics. Um, and this seems to me to be in the same kind of class of social influence on science. But when it comes to the actual cognitive content, when it comes to the theory itself and it's meeting a certain set of operational criteria, um, I don't really see how a good science can be done um, that adheres to social justice bias. Now, I acknowledge I probably shouldn't be so quick to say that. I acknowledge the possibility, as I said earlier, of wiggling your ears and sticking out your tongue, and there's a way of acquiring theory that meets those operational criteria. To my knowledge, social justice bias hasn't had a role in facilitating that.
Oh, hell yeah! I can disagree
All right,
cogently. Woo!
cool. We have like 8 or 9 minutes, so let's
Okay, so
try to
let's.
get into it.
All right, the blood will be so sweet. It has been boiling this entire time. All
All
right,
right, let's go.
so let's say that you were trying to figure out a way to convert homosexuals into straight people,
Mhm.
and you conducted. You have a model that is very accurate in its predictions. It's very efficient in its explanations. It's very flexible. It's optimally flexible, and it has a rational coherence to it. Would you consider that good science?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, so you would consider that good science. And of course, a social justice advocate would say, well, no, that's bad science because it's harming other people. It goes against what science ought to do. And so you can see where the value is the social justice values there become really complicated, even though they're attacking good science.
I see. So can we agree on a distinction then between the content of the cognitive content of a scientific theory and the application of the scientific theory? So the
I
physics.
acknowledge there's a distinction there, but I think it's a distinction without a meaningful difference. I mean,
How come?
because you don't really perform science in order for it to just stay there. It's usually to some greater purpose. You want to apply that science.
Really?
I think so,
Yes.
yeah.
What about particle physics?
Oh man, I have. You could make up a definition of particle physics right now just to mess with me, and I would believe you.
Well, okay. Well, let's talk about theoretical physics. I do know that historically, things that start out as theoretical physics. You know what? Let's not even go into high energy and particle physics. Let's go into black hole cosmology, right? We acquire knowledge of black holes. What social purpose does that serve?
I don't really, well, other than our like general social curiosity, I'm not sure.
Is curiosity a social phenomenon, though? Is it
I
something
think
that we
so.
choose
I think
because
that what you're curious in is heavily dictated by your culture. Yeah.
it can be influenced by it, sure. Um, but the feelings of curiosity, the desire to know things, wouldn't that be part of that impulse that we agreed upon earlier?
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah, general curiosity, absolutely. But you know, that
yeah,
general curiosity can be focused, and really can only be focused on things that are in your environment, which is heavily dictated by what culture you live in, right?
yeah, I agree. So curiosity is the clay. Okay, when it comes to curiosity, nature is the clay, and society shapes that clay into whatever shape of the thing you're curious about. That was a horrible, horrible metaphor.
No, it worked.
But okay, um, where's I'm trying to locate our disagreement.
Um, to bring it back just a little bit, so I actually agree with you in that uh, a a really well done model that could successfully convert homosexual people into heterosexual people is by definition good science. Based on the criteria that we've set, it's and even based on the criteria that I've set, we figured out something that is true, something that we can do, and something that's an actionable task that can be occurred. But I think social justice has a right, and it is a moral good, in my morality at least, to step in and say, well, no, this science is bad because the knowledge, this science coming into existence, puts it into perspective that sexuality can be changed, and then it will be used by people who think it ought be changed. So it is a net, in my worldview, it is a net negative to society that this good science was done. Does that make sense?
I think I see where you're coming from, and I have to fundamentally disagree. Finally,
Finally.
because yes, because I think I do still believe in this distinction between application and theory. And just to give an example of this, you take ammonium nitrate, which it plays a central role in the Haber process, and the Haber process is what raised there's carrying capacity for human beings to the billions. I mean, literally billions of people are alive because of the Haber process. But at the same time, ammonium nitrate is a central ingredient in explosives. All of the explosives used in World War II, with the notable exception of two of them, made use of ammonium nitrate, and also excluding, I think, TNT. I'm not 100% sure. But so you can kind of see here, it's a double-edged sword when it comes to how you can apply scientific knowledge, but the knowledge itself seems to be value neutral.
I could see that to a certain extent, but I still fundamentally disagree that there's a meaningful distinction between that knowledge production, that knowledge existing, and its application. Because, no, in order for knowledge to be applied, it must exist first. So there's a direct through line between the knowledge coming into existence and then its application. So,
Sure, but the knowledge existing is more fundamental, right? But the application, the existence comes prior to the application.
yeah.
So the knowledge existing on its own, it's value neutral, and then when it's applied, now there's a value component that's attached to it. Is my point of view.
Okay, do you think that social justice advocates would be right or wrong to protest research being done that would cure people of homosexuality? Do you think social justice advocates would be right to do that?
Well, I don't know if it means anything to say cure homosexuality, but and I think they have the right to protest whatever they like. But when it comes to research into that, I do think this would fall under category one, like we were talking about earlier, resource allocation and the extent to which we're willing to pursue a particular scientific activity. I would not agree with them. This would be one of the areas where social justice advocates and I would butt heads, but it's not because of any particular negative feelings I have toward gay people. I just think that the proper function of the scientific activity is the production of knowledge, and that knowledge itself is fundamentally value neutral.
Um,
Well, socially value neutral. Obviously, there are epistemic values.
okay. I guess that's where our primary, and I think that you need to go soon. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay. I want to say one last thing, and I'll let you wrap us up, okay?
sure.
So I do think that there is that social justice, and I define social justice very broadly, it's just the betterment of humanity, as vacuous as that statement is. That should be the goal of why we conduct science, either for the joy of learning, or for the betterment of humanity in some sort of technical process. Like we can cure something, we can make people's lives better, and all the value-laden language that entails. I think that's something that we ought to do, and I think that the production of knowledge that would harm humanity ought to be protested against and ought to be stopped. Like, the knowledge for its own sake is fine unless it harms other people. And I think social justice is a good lens, maybe not the way that's. I know social justice is very, very divisive, but I hope that I've defined it broadly enough to say that if there's some form of social justice that we can agree on that ought to guide scientific research. That's my opinion of. And so, in that case, fundamental question that we've that we were supposed to talk about, and we did. We did. I think it was really fun.
It was a good talk.
Yeah, I think it.
I don't have anything to wrap up on this point. I mean, I guess I would respond by saying that what you're talking about when it comes to the betterment of humanity, well, betterment of humanity implies betterment of each individual, and I could talk about the primordial origins of that, of how the science accommodates those impulses that come prior to the existence of any society, but we are coming short on time, and
That
I
could
just want
be another discussion,
possibly,
a robust
yeah,
discussion.
yeah. So this has been a very good discussion. I had a very good time, and I enjoyed reading and preparing for it as well. And you
Oh,
mentioned you did too. This is a very broad, very rich topic.
yeah,
Uh,
I did not get into a tenth of what I researched, but I guess that's a good thing, right? I,
well,
all that learning.
you still gain something,
Yeah,
and
exactly. I still got something. I still had a lot of fun. Uh,
I hope you gain something from this conversation as well.
I did very much so. Casey, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. It was a very cordial conversation, and I would be open to talking to you again.
Likewise,
All right, you have a good night.
likewise.
All right, have goodbye.